Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Diarmuid Torney. I'm Director of the Institute for Climate and Society here in Dublin City University and an Associate Professor in the School of Law and Government here in DCU. You're all very welcome to this afternoon's webinar entitled COP30 Prospects for Climate Cooperation in a Turbulent World. The DCU Institute for Climate and Society is Ireland's first academic research centre devoted to promoting perspectives on climate change from the social sciences and humanities. We examine how different societal arenas such as politics, media, education and business can influence climate action. In less than a week, representatives of the world's governments will gather in Belém, Brazil, at the gateway to the Amazon rainforest for this year's United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP30. It is now 10 years since the historic Paris Agreement on climate change was adopted. 10 years on, we see a mixed picture. The rollout of clean energy has progressed faster than many would have predicted a decade ago. Before the Paris Agreement, the world was heading for over 4 degrees Celsius of warming. Now projections are around 2.7 degrees. That's nowhere near where we should be, of course, but a lot better than where we were a decade ago. Last week's NDC synthesis report by the UN projected global emissions falling by around 10% by 2035, leading United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres to state boldly that it is now, quote, inevitable, unquote, that humanity will overshoot the Paris Agreement's commitment to limiting warming to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius, with devastating consequences, he said, for the world. Added to that is a global multilateral order that is under increasing strain, driven by a US administration seemingly intent on ripping up the rules. Against this backdrop, what can we expect from COP30? Among the issues in focus this year are the mitigation gap, adaptation and resilience, climate finance, just transition, and an overarching need to move from rhetoric to a focus on action and implementation. To discuss the key issues facing COP30 and to set the scene for us, we are delighted to be joined this afternoon by a distinguished panel of experts. I will introduce each of them properly in just a minute, but first some housekeeping. The webinar will last for approximately 1 hour and will run roughly as follows. I will introduce each of our speakers in turn and ask them an opening question. We will then move to a discussion among our panel members. And then during the final 20 minutes or so, we will take questions from you, the audience. Please use the Q&A function on Zoom to pose questions to our panelists, and we'll keep an eye on that Q&A function during the webinar. And so to our opening contributions. I'll begin with Ali Sheridan, who is lead with the UN High-Level Climate Champions, where she oversees the world's largest climate coalition working to halve global emissions by 2030. Ali is also chair of Ireland's Just Transition Commission. Ali, can you begin by telling us a bit about the UN High-Level Climate Champions? What does it do and what will your role be at COP30?
Sure. Thanks, Diarmuid, and hello everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I will say I'm knee-deep in preparing for COP and hence might have a tendency to use acronyms or COP jargon at this stage, Diarmuid, so at any stage feel free to jump in and ask me to explain. But yeah, I work with the High-Level Climate Champions, which is an initiative that was set up post-Paris, and it was really in response to the challenge between connecting what is agreed at the COPs from parties, from countries, and then how does that actually translate to the rest of society? So to communities, to cities, to companies, how can we better connect the links? And I suppose there was 2 goals to setting up the champions. One was that connection piece, being able to downscale what is agreed at COP into kind of real world actors. And then also the creation of an ambition loop. So knowing that while, yes, COP is critically important, yes, what parties agree sends a very strong signal, that can also be enhanced by what the rest of society does, right, in terms of sending their own signals about the type of ambition that they want to see, the type of climate action that they want to support. So over the last few years, the focus has really been on mobilization. So mobilizing those non-state communities, again, whether that's cities, subnationals, banks. Now we have healthcare institutions, education, and getting them to A, commit to net zero, and B, start putting credible transition plans in place that reflect the scale and the science of what we need to see. We also have our counterpart campaign, which is Race to Resilience, which is now very much focusing on adaptation, just transition and equity. So up until this year, we had a situation where we had two what's called action agendas, one for parties and one for everyone else. And this was kind of lending itself to this issue of separation between the two. With Brazil's presidency this year, we've seen quite an important innovation where we're now going to have one action agenda moving forward. And the goal, again, is to bring a much more coherent approach to climate action. So the focus this year has been much less on mobilization and much more towards implementation. And a phrase that's probably new to a lot of people, but I think we're going to be hearing a lot about it in the next few weeks, is the action agenda. So this has been worked on by myself and my team and others for the last few months. And it's really taking what's been pledged, what's been signaled to, what's been committed to over the last number of years, and putting it into implementation detail. What do we need to achieve? Who's doing what? How is it being financed? How are we measuring impact? There's a lot of process that has gone into that. It's going to be a difficult one to communicate, I think, coherently, given the complexity, but it is a real signal, I think, of intention towards focusing on implementation now, and a real test of the ecosystem's ability to work with each other, collaborate, and bring a bit of cohesion to this work. So that's been the focus for the last few months, and I suppose at COP we'll see it tested in real life for the first time, and hopefully it will be the beginning of what is not just this COP's approach, but ideally the next few years as well.
Thanks very much, Ali, for that introduction. Next, I'll turn to Matt McGrath. Matt is an award-winning environmental correspondent with the BBC News, with a demonstrated history of working in broadcast and online media. He was the first international winner of the BBVA Biophilia Award, and is also a former science journalism fellow at MIT. Matt, you've covered many COPs. Can you tell us about the key issues you'll be following in Belém this year, and what strategies you'll use for covering what can sometimes seem to the public as a dull technical conference?
Yeah, I wish I had a quick answer for the how to keep it interesting, Diarmuid. I'm not sure I do, but thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me here, and thank you for everybody for taking part in this. I'm a journalist. I write about issues related to climate and how big an issue this is around the world. And I guess before I get into the detail of what the nuts and bolts of the issues might be in Belém, I think there's a bigger overarching question that comes up in all my conversations in the BBC and outside the BBC, which is, what is this COP for? You know, what we've had the Paris Agreement, we've agreed all the detail or most of the detail on that. What is the prime function of this gathering? Is it just a jolly for some leaders to come to some part of the world? Is it, is it very technical? Is it very detailed? Is it dealing with action agendas and resilience and adaptation and a whole range of stuff like that? That is interesting to the people, to the participants, but doesn't cut through to the general audience. And the thing that's coming back to us from people within the BBC and outside it is, how do we connect this whole thing, this whole apparatus, to the lives that people are living, to the energy bills that people are facing, to the questions that people have? The skepticism that's risen in the UK and elsewhere in the last year or two, as those bills have risen, skepticism about net zero, and we're seeing that across the piece from the United States and elsewhere. So that for me is the big overarching question. What's it all for? What's it going to try and achieve this year? And does it have a future? Like the way we're doing these COPs, and does it really have a future? In the nitty gritty of lots of different things, obviously this whole idea the Brazilians have of having a leader summit at the start, making everybody go there a week early to do that, and then having the COP coming off the back of it. I don't know how that's going to play out. Nobody really does. And we've got about 60 world leaders. Michal Martin's going, Keir Starmer's going, but not many others. Obviously, Trump is not likely to go, and the United States is not likely to have a team there at all. So, are we going to see fights over agendas? Are we going to see fights over the IPCC and science? Are we going to see battles about issues relating to money and to language about mitigation and things like that? And will the US proxies, if you like, Saudi Arabia and others, will they speak up and get into battles? What we saw at the International Maritime Organization meeting just a few weeks ago, I mean, people who were there, Eamon Ryan wrote a piece in the Irish Times about it, saying, look, this was ridiculous arm twisting and naked politics being put in place to clamp down on the proposal to put in place a carbon levy. Will they take similar tactics into Belém? And I suppose one of the big questions also is, what are the Brazilians doing? What is their aim there? What do they want to get out of this event? Is it just to bolster their credentials in the world? Why would they announce 2 weeks before the COP that they're going to do exploratory drilling for oil in the mouth of the Amazon? There's a lot of contradictory signals coming out from Brazil. We don't really know what kind of COP we're going to get. I'm hoping it'll be interesting. I'm hoping to try and make the news out of it by, having, I imagine people will want to get into, some bits of Barneys over certain things. And that's, I think, interesting. We understand from the Brazilians there's not going to be a cover decision at the end. At the moment, we understand that's the case. And that leaves us with a very difficult, I understand why they're doing it. I don't think they want to have a big fight on the floor, but in terms of telling the story to an audience, have they agreed something? Have they done a deal? Even though it's our simplistic, reductive language, those stories actually cut through quite very well in terms of numbers. So, yeah, I'm perplexed as to what we're going to get. And here, I'm on my way to Belém. I'm here in my Salubrious hotel in Heathrow, and about to fly out tomorrow morning. But I have no idea what we're going to meet on the ground, to be absolutely honest. I think it could be brilliant. It could be a disaster. It could be somewhere in between.
Great. Thanks very much, Matt. And thanks for stopping off with us en route to, I think, from Cardiff, am I right?
Yeah, exactly. It's
where you live.
Yeah, I'm out from Cardiff. So, yeah, it's a handy little stop. But, I'll tell you the story another time, Diarmuid, about how lucky I am to actually be here, but never mind, eh?
Right. Okay. Well, thanks very much for that, Matt. So next I will turn to Ross Fitzpatrick, who is a Policy and Advocacy Officer at Christian Aid Ireland. Ross contributes to the organisation's work on climate and economic justice, focusing on issues of human rights, corporate accountability and tax avoidance. Ross, what aspects of the negotiations are a priority focus for Christian Aid? And can you tell us a bit about what it's like to be an NGO representative as a COP, because you've been there before?
Thanks, Diarmuid, and thanks to DCU for organising this webinar, first and foremost. And apologies for joining a little bit late. I was having some technical difficulties with Zoom. So to answer the second part of your question first, on a personal level, I would say that being an NGO representative at COP can be extremely challenging and at times depressing, particularly being a fly on the wall during the negotiations and seeing the geopolitics kind of play out in real time. But it's also at times hugely empowering to witness the collective power that civil society can have on the negotiations, especially when civil society decides to act and speak with one voice. I've been at the past 3 COPs now, and all of those took place in countries with authoritarian governments, fairly abysmal human rights records, and virtually no independent civil society. So as an NGO worker, it can be quite intimidating, but also morally challenging when you're warned by UN officials not to openly criticize the host country for fear of being deported or even detained. But even with all those challenges, I would say that there are rare moments of hope. So like at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, when a loss and damage fund was established, after almost 3 decades of sustained advocacy by civil society, but also developing countries. But it does kind of increasingly feel like an uphill battle at the moment, given the resurgence of climate denialism in the US, the continued presence of the extremely powerful fossil fuel lobby at COP, and I think even perhaps more concerning from an Irish perspective, how far climate seems to have fallen down the political agenda of this government. Having said all that, I honestly don't think it's helpful to give in to despair. And even if we do breach the 1.5 degree threshold, which looks increasingly likely, it's just not acceptable to give in. And every single degree of warming counts at this stage in terms of limiting the catastrophic impacts of climate change on people. And that's the message that we very much lead with in our advocacy as a development organization. So we work closely with local partners and communities on the ground who are experiencing devastating impacts of climate change on a daily basis. And it's really their voice and demands that we're trying to bring to the table as much as we possibly can at the COP negotiations. The crucial thing that we try to highlight in our advocacy at Christian Aid is the profound injustice of climate change, whereby it's the world's poorest and most climate vulnerable countries who are experiencing the worst impacts, despite having virtually no responsibility for causing this situation in the first place. And for Christian Aid, that essentially translates into kind of two key asks of the Irish government. First, we want to see Ireland cut its own emissions as quickly as possible so that we do our part in reversing the global emissions curve. And secondly, we want to see Ireland deliver on our climate finance pledges to developing countries, as well as then radically scaling up what we're providing in line with our fair share of the new global target that was agreed in Baku last year. I think the outlook for Belém is not hugely optimistic, to be honest, and there are lots of reasons for that. But I think a key factor here is the kind of perpetual sticking point of climate finance in the negotiations. And the really unjust outcome in Baku last year certainly hasn't helped in this regard. I think everyone accepts that the finance needs in developing countries are absolutely staggering. But there's no clear agreement on how this money should be raised, and more importantly, by whom. And I think the key thing to remember here, though, is that there is money available to provide the funding that's necessary for the climate transition. Unfortunately, a lot of that money is still flowing in the wrong direction, including to entities like the fossil fuel industry. But there are some positive signs, including a global initiative, the Global Solidarities Task Force, to introduce new taxes on aviation and shipping, for example. But again, the issue here is that there isn't the level of collective buy-in from most wealthy countries to actually make these things a reality yet. So I'll end by saying that none of these things are impossible to achieve, despite what we often hear from richer countries at COP. But they will require much bolder political action than we've seen to date. And I think as well, an ideological shift to actually enforce climate justice and the polluter pays principle. And our hope in Christian Aid is that Ireland can kind of be at the forefront of these efforts. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ross, and apologies for the technical difficulties you were having. Very glad you were able to join us in the end. Apologies also to our next speaker, who similarly had technical problems, but who was able to join us in the end. And that person is no stranger to these webinars. It's Dr. Sinead Walsh, who is Principal Research Fellow at ODI Global, a UK-based think tank, as well as a freelance consultant and author. Before joining ODI Global, Sinead was Climate Director at Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs from 2020 to 2025. She previously served as the EU Ambassador to South Sudan and Irish Ambassador to Sierra Leone and Liberia. Sinead, you've attended the last number of COPs as part of the Irish government delegation. This year, you're attending in a different capacity with ODI Global, but I imagine you'll continue to focus on the themes of adaptation, vulnerability, and financing. How are you approaching this year's COP, and what will your work there focus on?
Thanks, Diarmuid, and good to see everybody and be back on this annual event. It's always useful to me to get my thoughts together before COP. So yeah, I rather predictably, somewhat one-trick pony-like, will continue to focus on adaptation and adaptation finance in particular. So Matt, you asked a lot of questions, a lot of which I don't have answers to, but I do think, in fairness to Brazil, they have put quite a lot of emphasis on adaptation in all of those kind of communiques in a way that we've never seen a presidency do before. So I also don't really know what is going to happen in many aspects, but I do think that they are genuinely trying to push adaptation finance. I mean, a lot of the people on watching this will be familiar already with the fact that we have these enormous needs for adaptation finance in developing countries. You know, there's figures around 300 billion a year, and all sorts of you know, really astounding numbers that are needed for, you know, all the kind of infrastructure and work with you know, work that farmers have to do to adapt their agriculture, all the kind of things that we need to do, even just to adapt to the world that we have now with the existing level of warming. And yet, you know, 82% of climate finance is going to mitigation. So we are extremely squeezed on adaptation finance. So that's definitely going to be my my main focus, and particularly, you know, for those kind of the poorest countries, the least developed countries, the small island states, and the conflict affected countries. And I was glad, Ali, to hear you talk about the race to resilience, because one of the problems we have in adaptation finance at the moment is that the private sector are generally not all that interested. They're much more interested in mitigation. And I think it's really good that we are seeing, outside the kind of negotiation space, that we are seeing kind of action on trying to, you know, encourage the private sector to get more involved, because we do need that as well. And then I suppose there's sort of two other issues where I think I will also be paying a lot of attention, Diarmuid. One of them is a little bit nerdy, so I won't spend too much time on it, but it's this concept of how do we pull money together at country level for climate finance in a way that's really owned by the country. So many of us have been working on the kind of concept of country platforms where, you know, the developing countries are really driving the agenda. We previously had a bunch of these that were based around phasing out particular fossil fuels. So colleagues might have heard about they were called the JETPs, the Just Energy Transition Program. So South Africa phasing out of coal and that kind of thing. And I think the feeling is that, you know, a lot of what happened there was not ideal, and we really need to put the countries much more in the driving seat. So there's a kind of a special day at COP where there's going to be a lot of talk about that, and I'm kind of looking forward to seeing how can we promote more money going to the country level, and how can we also get those country platforms to be more about adaptation. And then the last issue where I'll spend a lot of time is around gender. The US has been mentioned, and the US is one of the countries that are pushing back on, you know, climate language, but also gender language across all sorts of international fora. And we have seen, even in the kind of mid-year COP, the more technical mid-year COP that we had in June, we saw that a lot of other countries were getting on the bandwagon and pushing back against language that, you know, recognized the need to have, you know, to recognize the different impacts of climate change on different genders, because it is disproportionately affecting women and girls. So there is a gender action plan to be agreed at COP, and I don't think we're expecting that to be especially easy or non-contentious. So that'll be the third issue where I'll be spending a lot of time, I'd say.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Sinead, and thanks to all four of our panelists for that opening round of contributions. So we'll now move into the a panel discussion for the rest of the webinar. And I'll lead off with a couple of questions of my own, with an encouragement to our audience to pose questions in the Q&A function. I can see there are a number of questions there already, with John Sweeney, a previous panelist in these webinars, contributing to the questions. So please, everyone, continue to post your questions there. But can I start off by asking anyone on the panel who would like to comment on, to pick up on this theme of the host and the venue? So the role of the Brazilian presidency as COP president, and the symbolic value, if any, of hosting the COP in the Amazon basin. and linking that to this this initiative of the Brazilian presidency to launch the Tropical Forest Forever facility. So, on that piece on the one hand versus the clear logistical challenges that hosting in this particular venue is posing in terms of accommodation and access and so forth. Would anyone on the panel like to come in on that?
I can maybe
Yeah.
say something briefly on that, Diarmuid. I think, it may not be well known that there are actually 3 different COPs, and that this is just one of them. So you've got your climate COP, you've got your nature COP, you've got your desertification COP. I think it's kind of a bit crazy that we have 3 interrelated processes. And I think Brazil, really trying to center this COP. I know there's been huge difficulties with accommodation, and that, that remains. I got a text from a really senior SIDS person the other day to say, I'd love to talk to you about the issues, but I'm actually still trying to get hotel rooms. So, that's been a huge issue. But I do think there's a real symbolic importance, because I think we need to challenge this siloization, and start seeing that climate, nature, and desertification are actually all absolutely interrelated issues. I think the other reason why it's important, it comes down to the role of Indigenous communities, and how, Brazil have been trying to say that Indigenous communities are going to be a big part of this COP. I mean, we just have to wait and see. Sometimes that can be a little bit tokenistic. So let's see how it kind of plays out. But I do think the symbolism is important, and that the tropical forest facility, again, there are real challenges, as we've been saying, with climate finance, and we need to be doing things in new ways and coming out with new instruments. And so that is they're certainly trying to do that with this. I think it's now 25 billion pot that they have, which is, looking at forests in 74 countries, as far as I know. So it's a huge initiative, and they're really trying to get the private sector, very, very involved in getting that money in. So I think that could be one of the positive things to come out of the COP.
Thanks, Sinead. Matt, can I maybe ask you to comment on, from the perspective of a journalist, a broadcast journalist, how do you think the setting, like, will you be, showing footage of the Amazon, or, how does it affect your framing and your coverage of the COP?
Yeah, I think that undoubtedly, that will certainly be part of it. And, we're going to do something on Brazil and oil, because where we are, there'll be a lot of references to that. And I think, the symbolic nature of it will do a lot of it. But I imagine, I don't know how far that symbolism will carry if people are, if there's difficulties and challenges, and the logistic thing becomes really, really difficult. If a number of small island states can't turn up, or if they only have, a token presence, it becomes self-defeating, and we will report that as self-defeating, for the Brazilians. So I think it's a great idea, but I think in many ways, I don't know if it'll work, to be honest with you. And I don't know if it might end up becoming the story of when the time they tried to have the COP in the Amazon, and it didn't work out particularly well. I hope it does. I mean, I do hope. I mean, despite the fact that it's less of a story for us as journalists to have a positive news story in that sense, I suppose, than a negative one. I would be concerned that many things would be not as good, or as if they had been taken place in Rio or Sao Paulo.
Thanks, Matt. I don't know, Ross or Ali, do either of you want to come in on that question?
Yeah, I might just say really quickly, I suppose Brazil might say, that this is the reality of climate change on show in Belém as well. We're going into a city right on the edges of the Amazon. We have 60% of folks living in favelas. 40% of the city is below the sea level. Yellow fever, etc., is getting worse because of the heat and climate change impacts. So this is the reality of climate change, and it's on show. And in terms of who gets to talk about it and who gets to link it into negotiations, I think is important. But we can't ignore the credible questions around how is this going to work around inclusion and equity of voices. And like Matt says, that's yet to be tested. I do think, though, you know, there is that interesting question around the negotiations and seeing the reintroduction this year of the regional climate weeks, the pre-COP, the leaders forum at different times. There's maybe a question here around how the negotiations are going to evolve to be more or less one time a year kind of negotiations, especially now that we're getting into this complexity of implementation. So I think there was a lot of innovation on show from the presidency. It's not tested yet. So let's wait and see. But I do think it's an interesting and slightly brave approach as well.
Thanks, Ali. Ross, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, very briefly, I kind of agree with what everyone said. You know, I think from an NGO perspective, Brazil hosting COP30 in the Amazon is huge. We've all witnessed the frightening scale of deforestation in one of the most important carbon sinks on the planet. And I think the symbolism there couldn't be clearer. The destruction of the Amazon is not just detrimental to Brazil, but to the entire world. It's also a powerful reminder, as Sinead said, that climate, biodiversity, and the rights of indigenous peoples are intertwined. And many of those indigenous peoples will make the journey to Belém. But as Matt said, whether or not that kind of symbolism leads to meaningful action is another question. But hopefully it can help reshape political will. And I think the new forest facility, if it's established, can help reinforce that message.
Thanks very much, Ross. Can I turn next to a question around mitigation? So I referenced that synthesis report in my opening remarks. You know, against that backdrop that we know that about 2/3 of the countries of the world haven't delivered updated NDCs, and that collectively the current set of NDCs are you know, far short of what is needed on the mitigation front. What if anything do you think the political moment of this COP can deliver, given that the global stocktake and the process that followed it hasn't kind of mobilized the kinds of strengthening of NDC commitments on the mitigation side that we would have hoped for? So does anyone particular want to come in on that?
Quite depressing, David, I think, really, to be honest with you. I mean, it's like, you know, everybody's been hoping that, you know, China was going to ride to the rescue and come in with a stonking NDC that was going to lift, you know, see the end of fossil fuels and all the rest of it over the next decade. And it's kind of like a bit meh. So I don't know if there's anything specific that will be able to come out of Belém that will lift ambition and put countries in a place to lift ambition. I don't know if that's realistic, and in the absence of a cover decision, which might again call for transitioning or languaging around the movement away from fossil fuels, in the absence of that, what will we get? I don't know that we will get anything that would that would put more pressure on countries and actually encourage countries to do more. I don't know that we will get something like that. Sorry to be I don't want to be a pessimist about this, but I mean, you know, I think that's the way it's shaping up.
Thanks, Matt. Sinead, you have your hand raised there.
Yeah, I think there will be a cover decision, Matt, but that's just my...
I hope you're right. I do hope you're right.
I'm hearing more and more. I'm hearing more and more that you know, it's, look, they're only rumors until they actually happen, but I'm hearing more and more that there will be. And I think it could be difficult for the presidency. I mean, maybe just for people who aren't quite as nerdy about COPs, you know, sometimes a cover decision is a way for a presidency to say some things that won't be said in the individual negotiation room. So it can be quite handy for a presidency, and I kind of suspect that they'll end up doing that. I mean, you know, in terms of mitigation, I kind of agree. I don't know that this COP can do a huge amount. There's some talk that the two targets of doubling energy efficiency and tripling renewables will sort of be formalized somehow, which maybe could be in a cover decision if that happens. But I think maybe for me, the more interesting point is how much Brazil has been focusing on the reform of the COP process. And I think that there's some really interesting possibilities in there, because I think we all kind of say all the time, you know, that we don't think COPs are fit for purpose for these enormous challenges that we're facing. But then, you know, the process just sort of chugs along. And I think Brazil, I mean, more than any presidency that I can think of, has really been putting some time and effort into trying to get ideas on what COP reform could look like. And in terms of how this links to the mitigation question, something that, you know, has been discussed is like, can COP start being more about accountability, right? So Ali said at the beginning, this COP should be more about implementation, the rule book is agreed and all of that. And I would very much agree with that. So if the COPs are supposed to be more about implementation, then surely they should be about, you know, having more accountability. And can Brazil put in something on COP reform at COP30 that could help, you know, that could mean that countries have to come back to COP31, wherever that is, and COP32, and actually say, okay, we said we were going to do this on mitigation, and this is what we've done. So maybe a slightly more optimistic, or maybe it's more a hopeful view from my side.
Thanks, Sinead. Ross, and then Ali. Ross, do you want to come in first?
Yeah, sure thing. I think the first thing I'd say is that, you know, there was a lot of criticism of Antonio Guterres's comments last week for being overly fatalistic. And I think that was justified. Even if we breach 1.5 degrees, which, you know, for all intents and purposes seems inevitable now, I just don't think it's politically wise or strategic to send out a message that climate action is basically futile. That kind of messaging only benefits, you know, the actors and special interests intent on continuing down our current path. At the same time, you know, given the geopolitical headwinds, it is hard to see anything hugely meaningful coming out of Belém on mitigation. But I am encouraged to hear from Sinead that, you know, there could be a cover decision, which I think could send an important political signal, particularly at a time when multilateralism itself is so under threat. But we're at a point now where, you know, what we really need is not another plan or a roadmap, but implementation on an urgent scale. And that level of urgency can begin to shift the emission curve downward. And I think it's worth remembering that we've already seen this before. You know, prior to the Paris Agreement, we were on track for around 4 degrees of warming, and we've managed to lower that to around 2.6, 2.7 based on current policies, which are still not enough, but it does show that, you know, progress can be achieved.
Thanks, Ross. Ali, over to you.
Yeah, just building on those points, like the signaling can never be underestimated, right? We none of us know what kind of room or ripe landscape for opportunity opens on reflection of different signals, and particularly around fossil fuel phase out and fairness and financing. But the structure now is really important, and it has been very central to this presidency's approach. Like over the last few months, my team and I, like, we've been knee deep in scanning every pledge and every initiative that was announced and launched over the last few years, 800 plus, right? So tracking them, understanding, are they still alive? Who's leading them? What did they commit to doing? What have they done so far? So there's a huge landscape there of already embedded infrastructure that is in the works from every region across the world, addressing every climate issue, made up of really diverse actors. And now all of that sits under one action agenda infrastructure. And that's been done in a matter of months. So not to get too wonky about it, but we have what's called now the 6 axes. And under those, we have 30 activation groups, and I lead a few of them. And they're made up again of unlikely allies who've come together because they're looking at common outcomes. They have kind of taken stock of what they've achieved collectively as groups or not to this point. They now have plans for what they're going to do over the next few years. So again, you know, I'm looking to Matt because this is a real comms challenge to try and make that complexity clear and understandable to the general public, but also where we need to be, right, in terms of any cover decision, how we're actually going to do it. And then on the proof piece, because, you know, to Ross's point, like the 1.5, you know, we have to bear witness to it and not hide away from it. But there is so much work happening as well. And the presidency has launched what's called a granary of solutions. It's an English translation. I'm not sure where the terminology came from, but with the idea of just flooding with what's already out there, right? What initiatives are up and running, what solutions are in the works, and just giving a sense of that critical mass and momentum, not hiding away from what needs to be done. And then to Sinead's point on the accountability, like a lot of work has gone into identifying the metrics, the KPIs, the accountability mechanisms, and all of that put together in a way that hasn't been done before. And all of that has been done under a matter of months under one presidency. So I think if we can get a link between the signal potentially of cover text, the infrastructure of the action agenda, and then the wider kind of support from civil society and beyond on climate, this could be a really unique moment for multilateralism if all the pieces fall together.
Thanks very much, Ali, and thanks to all the panelists for that round of contributions. We'll now move into questions from the audience. So I would encourage our panelists to take a look through the questions, and if there's any that you particularly want to answer that I am not posing, please feel free to come in. I'm also conscious of time. We have about a little over 15 minutes left, and we are constrained for time, but I might pose a couple. So the questions raised from the very general to the very specific. Maybe John Sweeney's second question around the impact of the US and the Trump presidency on the negotiations. Then there's a more specific question from John about the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, if anyone wants to pick up on that. And then there are a couple of process questions, one from David Scanlon around the involvement of the private sector in the COP, and a question from my colleague Dave Robbins about the extent of the Irish government delegation and whether any ministers are due to attend. So my understanding is that the Taoiseach is attending, and then Minister Dara O'Brien is attending for the second week. But so would anyone like to come in on any or all of those points? So the role of the US, fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, the role of the private sector, and the Irish delegation and ministerial attendance. Ross.
Yeah, I can come in on John's question on the US. As far as I understand it, there may still be some kind of official presence, as the US will only officially withdraw, I think, from the Paris Agreement in January next year, but I'm open to correction on that one. But yeah, I mean, based on what happened at the IMO a few weeks ago, I'd be fearful of a similar kind of tactics of intimidation being deployed at COP if there is a US presence there. And to John's point, I think the really concerning thing is that this type of politics is kind of already having the desired effect to a certain extent. There was a letter, I think, last week from the US Energy Secretary to all EU leaders calling on the EU to dismantle its recently agreed human rights and environmental due diligence law, or else basically face the consequences of gas supplies being cut off for the winter. Unfortunately, EU leaders are basically doing precisely that. They're in the process of, undermining that law. So I think rather than give in to these kinds of threats from the US, the EU in particular and the rest of the world needs to stand firm and build on existing alliances and create new ones. And I think we've already seen some proof that standing up to the Trump administration can be much more effective than simply giving in. Like Mexico is a good example of, how it has stood up to Trump. It's built much closer ties with Canada and Latin American partners, and that has reduced the dependence on US economic pressure. So I think the EU should, look to take a similar approach.
Thanks, Ross. Sinead, you're next.
Yeah, just on the US, I mean, my understanding, the latest I've heard is that they are likely to send a relatively junior delegation, which, I mean, might not be the worst thing in the world. I suppose that, the question, given the views that have been expressed, is not whether or not the administration is positive or negative on the COP, because it's been pretty clear, but the extent to which there will be active engagement. I think the IMO, the International Maritime Organization intervention was different because that actually did financially potentially affect US interests. So I would I would hope that that there's less interest in kind of expressing their views, because they are absolutely entitled and invited to come to this COP. I mean, I think one positive thing we can say is that nobody else has followed the US out of the Paris Agreement. So I think we need to count our blessings on that. And just a small addition on the government delegation. So Minister Neil Richmond, the Minister for Overseas Aid and Diaspora, will also visit in week 1.
Thanks, Sinead. Ali.
Thanks, Diarmuid. So look, I think we have to be honest, the impact of the US this year in particular has been felt. It's been a very difficult year across a number of different stakeholders, and the chilling effect and beyond has made itself known. However, the US is more than one person, or more than one administration. And I think when you start looking at cities and mayors and subnationals and other actors, you don't see them retreating. I think the landscape which they're operating in is a challenging one in terms of their ability to maybe speak up as they would have done in the past, but largely they're still there or finding ways to engage. And I think that's down again to just the undeniable case for climate action at this stage. We're not far off Storm Melissa and its felt impact, renewables, etc. So all of that still stands. And it's really important that, COPs are not just 1 year or one presidency term. So in terms of how we navigate it, it's for the long term. Just on the treaty, given I have a pass with the treaty, I'm very excited to see the folks down in Belém. I'm not sure in terms of outputs from this COP, but there's been some really good developments. The IUCN, the world's largest kind of biodiversity and environmental organization, put out a motion to back the fossil fuel treaty, and I thought that was a really interesting nexus of support between nature and fossil fuel phase out. And we're looking towards Colombia hosting the fossil fuel phase out summit early next year as well, which I think will be a real test for the treaty as a tool. And then I think there was a question just on the role of the private sector. I'm not sure of the overall context, but what's really interesting from the action agenda point of view is it starts to put some strings on private sector engagement and looking for those coming with climate transition plans, coming with finance, coming with their commitments thought through. So in terms of who is participating from the private sector is starting to be a different conversation, and looking at credible actors around the transition. So again, early days, but I think it's again an interesting shift in this approach to this COP in particular.
Great, thanks, Ali. So we have about 10 minutes left. I see there's a question in the chat around what the panelists would view as success at the COP. I might hold that back as a final question to you all. So put your thinking caps on for that. But in the meantime, I was going to group together a number of different kind of bigger picture questions around. So there's a question from Barry McMullen about kind of emergency measures like solar radiation management. Panelist thoughts on that. There's a question from a Ghanaian working in DCU, Dixon Boateng, talking about the challenges for developing countries in combining economic growth and climate change targets. There is a question from an anonymous attendee about just transition. Perhaps Ali, you might be able to speak to that. What's the goal of the just transition? And I see just a question from former Minister, now Senator Malcolm Noonan, former Minister for Nature, about is it time to merge the climate and nature COPs? So again, quite a wide-ranging set of questions there. But please feel free, all of you, to pick and choose from among that set of questions. Would anyone like to start? I don't know, Ali, is that a hand from the last round, or yeah? So solar radiation management, just transition, economic growth, development, and climate and nature.
I can go. Oh, sorry, Matt.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
No, Matt, go on. Go ahead. You haven't had me start.
The solar radiation management is interesting, isn't it? I mean, and all obviously that comes across as like on the flaky end of how do we deal with this issue, and whether or not there'll be much time given to that in the COP setting, I don't know. As journalists, we like that kind of story, or a fight or a battle over that. It's quite interesting. We try to represent views on that responsibly, but I think it obviously goes into the bigger issue about carbon dioxide removals and questions along those lines, and then we're into issues of carbon crediting, and that is a bit of a another challenging issue to get into, particularly in Brazil, I suppose, with the with everything that's happened there. So I don't know if that would be featuring in the, I mean, maybe not this COP, but maybe in a couple of COPs time we might get to solar radiation management, might have a more greater sense of discussion about it. I don't know.
Okay. Thanks, Matt. Ali, you were going to come in there as well.
Yeah, so just on just transition, so you mentioned at the top of the hour, I also have the privilege of chairing Ireland's Just Transition Commission, but looking at it from an international level, I think from a just transition point of view, the litmus test of this COP will be to see action, right? Radical and immediate action, because they're just inherent injustice to the consistent delays that we're seeing day in, day out. I think the process itself is going to be a test. We have seen a lot of commitments from the presidency around Indigenous involvement, around involvement of vulnerable voices, this concept of Nutrero. So throughout the year, reaching out to communities, the global ethical stocktake, a process to hear from those most impacted. But we've yet to see how they're actually going to land in the weeks itself and the outputs. The integration of just transition throughout the action agenda and other mechanisms is quite clear to see this year. We have specific asks on gender, vulnerable voices, Indigenous voices, adaptation and resilience. So it looks different, obviously, depending on the issue, the outcome, the region, but you can very clearly see the profile and the centralization of just transition starting to happen. It's too slow, but starting to happen in terms of climate action. And then I should say as well, like from an international kind of community point of view, I was in Scotland last week at the Scottish Just Transition Commission's Summit, and they'll be announcing an international network of peers quite soon as well, Just Transition Commissions around the world. So the profile of the issue, the importance of it as a lens to all of our climate action. And to Matt's point at the start, like we just have to move away from targets and timelines and technologies. They're important. We know what we need to do, but this now is about lives and livelihoods, it's people and places, and Just Transition gives us that opportunity, I think, to shift the communication and hopefully the dialogue on climate action as well.
Great. Thanks, Sally. Sinead.
Yeah, I'll be really brief because we're running out of time. I just wanted to say yes to Malcolm Noonan. I absolutely think that those COPs should be merged. It would be really great if there was some energy on that based on the obvious interconnections of having the COP in the Amazon. And just on Dixon's questions on balancing economic growth, it's just, they're absolutely critical questions. And I think it relates a little bit to what I was saying earlier about country platforms. There are real challenges at the moment with international finance, but actually, if you look at, say, the aid sector, climate money is being protected a lot more than other types of money. So I think it is an incentive to countries to try and, and sort of balance, kind of economic growth and to major on some areas like renewables and so on. So I think resources are so constrained. I think it does force us in hopefully a useful way to try and do multiple things at once and very much look at climate resilient development.
Thanks, Sinead. Ross.
Yeah, I'll also be brief. I was also going to respond to Dixon's question. I think the balancing economic growth with climate targets is probably one of the toughest challenges for countries like Ghana, where people obviously need jobs, infrastructure, energy access, and it can feel like a trade-off sometimes, but I don't think it has to be. And I think the key here is a global just transition that's underpinned by climate smart development. So huge investment in renewable energy, resilient infrastructure, sustainable agriculture that then creates economic opportunities whilst at the same time reducing emissions. But the really key thing here, I suppose, from our perspective, is that this requires international support at scale, predominantly through the provision of climate finance, so that developing countries like Ghana aren't forced to choose between prosperity and sustainability. And again, you know, that lack of provision of climate finance historically is one of the key reasons as to why we haven't seen climate action at the scale required in developing countries. And much of that, not all of it, but a lot of it is down to wealthy developed countries not meeting their climate finance targets over the last few decades.
Thanks, Ross. Ali, I see you've raised your hand, but can I move into that final question and maybe give you the opportunity to say what you wanted to come in with there in response to this final question from Darren Clark, which is what you would view as success at the COP. So max 30 seconds each, since time is against us. So we might go back in the order in which we started. So that's Ali, you're first.
Thanks, Diarmuid. Yeah, I was just going to make the quick point that, you know, when we're looking at things like finance, we have to start addressing the issues of finance and debt, for example. So countries forced to expand fossil fuels just to serve their debt. So just thinking about, you know, the design of that. So in terms of the outcome of COP, I think in this environment, in this landscape, having a very loud and coherent commitment to climate action and the COP process will be very powerful in the setting that we find ourselves in. I think strong signals, particularly around fossil fuel phase out, fairness and finance will be critical. And then really to Matt's point, starting converting this into what it means to people's lives, you know, both from a protection, both from a prosperity point of view, and really getting away now from what it's been important, but from the science and the targets and the timelines, and really just start talking to people about people.
Thanks very much, Ali. Matt, over to you next.
Yeah, I just echo what Ali says, really, that it has to be something tangible that people can feel they're connected to. And they've got to be able to see all the elements that Ali touched on there, the finance, the mitigation, they've got to see the adaptation, they've got to see all those things in real terms that in some meaningful way, and not just some remote process that's happening miles away and people are flying there in their private jets to take part in. I'm not using a private jet, I should add. But there's, you know, that whole story has got to connect and got to cut through. And I fear that it won't. And I'm hoping that if we're going to get a cover decision, that will certainly help.
Glad to hear you're leaving the private jet at home, Matt. Sinead, I know you're under time pressure, so I might go to you next and then come to Ross last. So Sinead, over to you.
Yeah, I'll also borrow from what Ali said so eloquently, and then I suppose more specifically in terms of my issues, I think if we could get a gender action plan that doesn't row back on what we've achieved in the past, I think that's really the best that we're going to be able to do. And I would love to see something concrete on adaptation finance. It might be a commitment to triple public adaptation finance, or it might be something else, but something tangible would be great that we can then work on implementing.
Great, thanks, Sinead. And Ross, over to you finally.
Thanks, Diarmuid. I think one kind of minor success would be if we got a new climate finance roadmap that sets a much clearer plan with, you know, clearly identified timelines and targets for all aspects of climate action, so mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage. A big problem with the previous 100 billion goal was that it was very vague and aspirational. It lacked a clear definition of what climate finance actually was. So many countries, you know, counted very questionable things. But I think beyond any kind of roadmap, which is important, the most powerful signal would be massively increased provision of public finance from wealthy historical emitters on their climate finance targets. And I end by saying, you know, this is not just me saying this. There was an International Court of Justice advisory opinion on climate change from earlier this year, which, among other things, clarified that the provision of finance from developed to developing countries is not voluntary, it's a firm legal obligation. So a new plan is important, but what we really need to see now is delivery.
Thanks, Ross, and thanks to all of our panelists. I'm sure you'll agree that it has been a really rich and informative discussion, and the conversation, I'm sure, could have gone on for a lot longer, but time is unfortunately against us. If you'd like to keep in touch with our work here at the DCU Institute for Climate and Society, please sign up to our monthly newsletter at dcu.ie/climate. You can also follow the Institute on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. A big thank you again to our four panelists, Ali Sheridan, Matt McGrath, Ross Fitzpatrick, Fitzpatrick and Sinead Walsh. Thank you also to my colleague Adela for all her work behind the scenes in preparation for and during the webinar. And finally, thank you very much to you, our audience, for joining us this afternoon and for the various questions you posted in the chat. We didn't get to all of them, but we got to quite a few of them. So thank you for your engagement and thank you and goodbye.